Hello and welcome to BookPage Live. I'm Kat Acree, an editor at BookPage, where we connect readers with their next great book. Every year in July, BookPage celebrates mysteries and thrillers and true crime during our annual Private Eye July. And one of our favorite picks from this year's issue is the latest from Grady Hendrix, author of the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, My Best Friend's Exorcism, and more. Our reviewer called his latest novel, The Final Girl Support Group, a quirky, refreshingly thoughtful homage to slasher films and the stalwart women who outfox their diabolical stalkers. Thank you so much for joining us today, Grady. This is so great.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
So first,
And I've
go
got to
ahead.
compliment you on your background. That red light is atmospheric.
It's the mood.
Yeah.
Like, we're having a spooky talk, like a slasher talk. So it's just like a subtle nod to
Yeah, I on the other hand look
murder.
like a hoarder, but I appreciate your Zoom background game.
No,
It
what
is
you look
very on
like,
point.
you look like a researcher. You look like someone who dives deep and who keeps it stacked behind them.
When I'm 80 years old and I live in a trailer with 9 million paperbacks, I'll say that to people who like pull up to ask for directions. I'm not a hoarder. I'm a
I'm,
researcher.
I'm a researcher.
I'm going to read all of them, I swear, eventually.
I can't get rid of them. I need them.
I need them. That's all. Yeah.
So I want to first talk about the concept of the final girl, this character from horror movies, this last woman standing. She gets to the end, she survives all the gore, maybe even kills the bad guy. And obviously in your novel, all the lead characters are final girls, but you've really turned the concept on its head. So the final girls in your book have lived through real life mass murders, each of which you've based off of like a classic 1980s horror movie. But in their world, after they've been through this traumatic event, then someone makes a movie franchise about it, which is really twisted. And then in the novel, someone starts killing the final girls, and we're in a race of time against time to solve it. But in doing this, in creating this premise, you've really melded two worlds, two areas of pop culture obsession. You've got the slasher movie franchises, and then you've also got like this true crime element. And so I really want to know, with these two areas, where do they overlap for you, and what were you exploring with this whole premise?
Well, they don't seem that bizarre to me. I mean, we live in a world where Jeremy Irons won an Oscar for playing Klaus von Bülow murdering his wife, Sunny, or putting her in a coma for the rest of her life. So, I mean, we sort of throw women to the circus, all the time. I mean, Lorena Bobbitt, Nicole Brown Simpson. I mean, her death launched many popular franchises. I enjoyed the miniseries based on her murder. So it's one of those things we seem to do on a pretty regular basis. So it didn't seem like that much of a stretch. So yeah, and then with slashers, it's funny. Serial killers seem to be the province of books. Slashers seem to be the province more of movies to a large extent, and sort of the tropes that come along with them. I mean, obviously there's crossover, right? I mean, Silence of the Lambs is a book and a movie, but there's a sort of faceless, nameless killer stalking people in a limited location with unusual weapons that seems to be the world of movies. And there seems to be sort of an almost supernatural, sometimes kind of sexy, kind of supervillain serial killer who you find in books like Silence of the Lambs or Temple Galt, Patricia Cornwell's series with Kay Sarpetta. So it's this really weird thing that's kind of infected books and movies slightly differently. And I really wanted to sort of I always felt like you get to the end of a slasher movie and you see these women, they've killed the killer, or they've watched all their friends die. And I'm always like, well, this is where I want the story to begin. Like, what happens next? I would imagine a lot of therapy, to be honest. And cruelly, there's usually a sequel, which is awful. Just when you think you've sort of like gotten out of this alive, the sequel pops up and you're dead, usually in the first few minutes. So it seemed to me like there was something really to explore here. I mean, what would it be like to go through this and then go through it again? I mean, do you ever feel safe? Can you ever let your guard down? How do you live in the shadow of that? And if it happens when you're 16 or 17, what does that mean for the rest of your life?
Mm-hmm. And you're also really exploring some concepts of ownership here. Who owns their own story? And especially in a world with tabloids, seeking to profit off celebrity trauma and drama. But also, as you mentioned, our media is just inundated with, film franchises trying to find real life things and, get a whole bunch of money off a miniseries. And as I was reading this book, I couldn't help but even think about like Britney Spears's conservatorship.
I
The
was just
questions,
about to say, yeah.
yeah, control and privacy that case brings up.
Yeah. Well, and it's fascinating, right? Like who does this stuff belong to? And it's weird. You look at someone like Elizabeth Smart, who's really, turned her abduction into a way to reach out to other victims and really like, turned it into a way to try to help people. And then you look at someone like Britney Spears, who's just her life story is not hers anymore. It's kind of public property. And it's a very weird thing. And yes, it happens to men too, but it seems to happen more often and on a more regular basis to
Mhm.
women. And I find that so strange. It's very like gothic.
Mhm.
I feel like we're all living in Rebecca.
Oh no. But like
We don't have names
we don't
and we have housekeepers who hate us.
so as I was thinking about this concept of ownership, I also, as like a reader, a heavy reader, one of the things I'm constantly thinking about is which character a story belongs to. And usually that's one of my favorite questions to, or that sometimes my favorite thing is when a story subverts that and it's not, the story belongs to a character you might not expect. Now, conceivably, any final girl would be taking ownership of their slasher movie, but it's kind of up to the reader or viewer to understand that. And then, as you mentioned, these sequels kind of keep that from happening because it just kind of keeps recurring. So I just kind of wanted to ask about your relationship with your audience as you're, considering these questions of ownership and um, privacy and storytelling power.
You mean like which character sort of the book story belongs to, or?
Yes, yeah, just
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Well, there's sort of two, and one is Lynette. I mean, she's the main character. It's the first time I've written a first person book, and it was so much fun to write her character because I always assumed that would be me. If something like this happened to me, that I'd, get 19 locks, put them on every door, never leave the house again, learn to shoot, not go anywhere without my concealed carry permit, and that kind of thing. And so it was and I really like writing characters whose entire worldview is based on a complete misconception. And Lynette's worldview is she's not safe no matter what. People said they were going to protect her, they didn't. So she has to protect herself. She will never be safe anywhere. It's up to her. And as one of my sisters told me, oh, that's kind of my life every day. So on the one hand, it belongs to Lynette. And a lot of this story was getting Lynette from this place of being sort of isolated and agoraphobic and shut down and almost unable to progress with her life beyond 17 years old when this horrible traumatic event happened to her. Like that's where she still is emotionally, and she hasn't moved on from there, and rightly so. She has no evidence the world is safe. But there's another character it belongs to in a bigger way, which is Adrian. And Adrian's one of the final girls. She's sort of considered the first one. And she's the one who sort of dedicated her life to helping final girls and helping women who've gone through violence and doing all these things to try to save them and trying to bring out the best in these women. And she's the one whose murder starts the book. We actually don't ever meet her when she's alive. But Adrian spent a lot of her life trying to reach Lynette. Lynette is one of her great failures. And so, in a way, this is Adrian's story of sort of redeeming Lynette. This is sort of the end of the things she wanted to do with her life to some extent.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad you brought up Adrian. So she plays, so I wanted to explain a deeper level that you went conceptually here that is very fun, in that all of the final girls in your novel have, they've, as I mentioned before, their mass murders are based on these horror films, these classic slasher horror films, but then their names are taken from the actors who played those final girls in those films,
Right.
which is a really fun little Easter egg for horror fans. And Adrienne King plays the final girl in Friday the 13th, which you mentioned earlier. And so I kind of I want to talk a little bit about Adrienne, but I also first kind of want to know how you chose which final girls from which franchises, because some of them are from sequels. And so it wasn't always necessarily the name I would expect if I was thinking of Halloween, for example.
Right. Well, with Halloween, because Danny, the character in the book, is gay, and Jamie Lee Curtis, who plays Laurie Strode in the first Halloween, her gender and sexuality and everything has been such red meat for public consumption. I mean, I remember being a kid and there was a schoolyard rumor that Jamie Lee Curtis was really born a man, and all this stuff. And I was just like, I just didn't want to do that to someone real. You know what I mean? Just to specifically comment on them in a way that had been, kind of gossiped about for years. And to be honest, also, I'm a huge Danielle Harris fan. Like, she's the star of Halloween 4 as a kid. And I actually think she gives a really great child performance in that. And I also think, one of the things that's interesting to me with the Final Girls is their relationship to these franchises is very similar to the characters' relationship to what happens to them. I mean, to these characters, something awful happens to them when they're 16 or 17, when they're too young to make many choices about what they're doing with their life. And it will follow them for the rest of their lives. And a lot of these actresses were kids. They were teenagers or young adults, or in the case of Danielle Harris, a kid, a literal kid. Being in these movies, and these franchises have kind of followed them for the rest of their lives, and some of them have come to peace with that. Some of them have a sort of difficult relationship with them, but it's something that they had to wrestle with. I mean, you look at we'll stick with Danielle Harris. I mean, I'm sure as a child actor this was just a gig, and then, oh my god, it turns into this thing where 30, 40 years later, she's still, people are still asking her about this character. So I think that's so strange, that parallel. But Adrienne's an interesting story because Adrienne, when I was a kid, I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated movies. And so I would read about them and pretend I'd seen them so that my friends didn't think I was a loser. And I managed to convince my scoutmaster that when we went for snacks at the gas station, I could use my snack money to buy magazines because reading is good. And so I bought I think it was issue 12 of Fangoria, April of '81. And it had Friday the 13th Part 2 on the cover and a big feature on the opening of the movie. So I could talk with real confidence in carpool about the opening of Friday the 13th Part 2. I couldn't do the rest of the movie. But at the beginning of the movie, Adrienne King, the final girl from Part 1, she's hanging around her house. It's kind of a crummy apartment, and talking to her mom on the phone, wearing these weird plaid overalls. And all of a sudden, Jason just appears and ice picks her in the head. And I was as a kid, I think I was 8 when I saw that. I was like, what? A character from a movie who's gone through all this horrible stuff just gets knocked off at the beginning of the next one. It was so casually cruel that it really just stuck with me. And it's the first time I started thinking about movie characters outside the movies, what else they're doing. They have lives and they're people. And it's interesting. So when I came out with Final Girls and had the early editions, I sent one to Adrienne King. A friend of mine had her address and she really loved it. And so we talked on the phone, and it was a really interesting conversation. She was a big fan. She loved the book a lot. And she told me that when she made Friday the 13th Part 2, she thought she was the star. They didn't tell her any different. And she had told them that she had some personal difficulties going on, but that she wanted to do the movie. And she didn't hear from a little while, and they heard. And she showed up thinking it was her first day on set, and the first day of the shoot. And it was really the last day of production. And they didn't show her the script. They asked her to improvise a phone call with her mom and do a few reaction shots. And then she didn't know what was happening until a stuntman, in Jason's costume, stabbed her with this prop, ice pick. And that was it. And she suddenly realized what had happened. And they just packed her up into the car, sent her back to her motel, and just dropped her and didn't pay her on top of that. But it was one day of work. And so they just ditched her. And it turns out that the personal difficulty she was having in her life, she thinks they probably assumed she was pregnant. The personal difficulty was she had a stalker. And it was someone who was taking pictures of her in public where she didn't see them and then leaving them on her doorstep. they really wrecked her life. And it got to the point where she had to install a lock on the inside of her bathroom door in order to feel safe enough to take a shower. And so it was really weird to me that there was this, that I don't know, that I had sort of wanted to rewrite a happier ending for this final girl played by this actress I'd never met, who was like 21 when she did that movie. And that was her relationship to this movie. And, she went on to she's had a long career as a voiceover artist and doing additional dialogue recording and everything. And she actually wound up, she really wanted to do it. And so we sort of made it happen, and she's the narrator for the audiobook, Final Girl Support Group. But it was this weird closing of the circle for both of us that was kind of very random and strange and really nice. It's kind of like this really gratifying moment that I got to connect with this person who sort of in a weird abstract way inspired this book, and, really hear about what was going on. To me, it was just a story in a magazine and a character in a movie. And to her, it was her life.
Yeah, talk about having a final girl take ownership of the slasher story, having Adrienne King read the audiobook. Is that like, what came first? Like, did you dream about a final girl being able to, like, one of the actors from those movies being able to voice your audiobook, or did that just come out of that conversation with Adrienne?
I had thought about it, but it really hadn't occurred to me. You know what I mean? It was like, that would be really cool. And then when I talked to Adrienne and she was talking about how much she loved it, I was like, oh my God, this makes total sense.
Yeah.
Like absolute sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about Friday the 13th as I was prepping for this talk with you. I wanted to kind of get in the mindset of slasher movies, but I didn't get very far because Friday the 13th kind of has a very fascinating history. And there's this overall theme in your novel that in the beginning of your novel, you kind of touching on about, the violence that men inflict against women. And, you're kind of exploring our fascination with that, or these films' fascination with that. But Friday the 13th is a prime example. And, to our viewers, apologies for the spoiler, but it's a 40-year-old movie. The slasher isn't a guy, it's a woman. And so that, and then you're talking, and, I was thinking too about the sequel to that, where it kind of falls into this, like, bad guy, big hulking brute slasher thing. And talk to me about that. I mean, you ended up choosing the source material of, like, the big hulking bad guy, but there's kind of a complicated history there about its own franchise subverting its story.
Yeah. And, it's actually in the book, I actually swapped Pamela Voorhees, Jason's mother, to be a guy, just because I wanted to avoid that kind of like thing, because that ties into this really, really rancid trope in serial killer fiction. This idea that mommy's to blame, and it's this idea, and you'll see it a lot once you start noticing it. There's all this stuff where, it's like people kill because their mothers were too close to them or too smothering, and turn them into sort of sissies and criminals. And, I mean, you look at it in Silence of the Lambs, it's like Silence of the Lambs is a book, which, I mean, I love the book, I love the movie, but there's a good serial killer who eats his victims and also murders a bunch of people during the movie. And then there's a bad serial killer who skins his victims, but doesn't kill anyone in the entire movie. But we know he's bad because he wears makeup and wants to turn into a woman. Like, that's the only difference between the two. And he's poor. Hannibal Lecter is clearly rich and cultured, and James Gumb is poor. But you can follow that all the way back to Psycho, the Hitchcock movie and the Robert Bloch book. This idea of, that's where a lot of this comes from, that this killer is a transvestite or trans and has this sick relationship with his mother. But you follow it back and you get to Ed Gein, who is the serial killer in Wisconsin, who was arrested, I think, in 1957, who inspired Robert Bloch to write Psycho. And Gein famously, I mean, Google Ed Gein and you will see everywhere, he's a mama's boy. He, had a corpse of his mother in the basement. He was a transvestite. None of that's true. No corpse of his mother in the basement. He wasn't a mama's boy in particular. I mean, he had a good relationship with his mother, but, she wasn't who people say she is. And he wasn't a transvestite. And all of that stems from fake, I mean, I hate to say it, but fake news. It was all quotes that are unattributed quotes in the early coverage of Ed Gein, where people were saying, oh, well, he's a transvestite and he has this domineering mother. These were people making these quotes who were either completely unnamed and no one knows who he was. They were giving quotes before he was even examined by a psychiatrist, or they were quotes from psychiatrists living in like Chicago and other cities, like who had never even gone to Wisconsin or met Ed Gein. And you kind of can trace it back. There was one polygraph interview with Ed Gein where the polygraph operator said, you like to dress in women's clothes. And Ed Gein was like, yeah, sure. And he's a highly suggestible individual. And it really stems from this huge, weird psychiatric trend in the 40s and 50s where people wrote all these books and articles, psychiatrists, psychologists, that mothers who were too close to their sons turned them into homosexuals, transvestites, and criminals, and sort of lumped the three together. And you know, it was this really busted theory. It wound up in the DSM, the Standard Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatric Disorders, that this causes transvestitism, being too close to your mother. And leave aside the fact that Ed Gein had a seriously abusive, violent, alcoholic father. You know, leave aside the fact that the Boston Strangler, whose psychological profile the police put together, said he was like probably a transvestite, effeminate, and had too close of a relationship with an overbearing mother. He also had a violently abusive, alcoholic father. Leave all that aside. Let's blame mom. And I find that like that sort of flows out like this toxic river to all these other properties, including Friday the 13th. You know, who's murdering all these people? Of course, it's a mother. You know, it's this really weird thing. And that's why I gender flipped it. I didn't want to play into that because I think it's really just toxic.
Yeah, and honestly, I haven't seen, especially in like the film world, I haven't seen a whole lot of breaking down of this idea. Like there was a film, Jodorowsky's Santa Sangre, which is this
Yes.
really, great movie, but it's very much like the mother is making him do it. And then I can't think of the name right now, but it was a Ryan Gosling film that was hyper violent. And it absolutely had sort of the same thing where it was like the mother is kind of making him do it. And that's a recent film. That's like an art house film.
Oh, yeah.
I
mean, there's still
continuing.
T-shirts that are sold with Ed Gein's face on them that say "Mama's Boy." It's like, and you know, you see them online. They're being worn by all these hipsters with full tattoo sleeves and beards and ear stretchers, and you're like, really? Like, you want to be so alternative, and you are playing into this huge anti-trans, anti-female, toxic cultural stereotype. It's really weird.
You know, you've in other interviews for this novel, you've said that the franchise is the monster. That's the main monster for you.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned before, the more I looked into Friday the 13th, its history is kind of monstrous. I mean, it's like a money-making scheme based on the fact that it was a really low budget thing to create, but they knew it would just be a cash cow, essentially a copycat of Halloween that was marketed, no joke, as lighthearted and youth-oriented. And like, you know, I thought about it, and with a lot of these slasher movies, this was often one of the first places where a young person was maybe seeing nudity. But then this nudity is immediately shamed with like violent, gory murder. You know, like is little kids watching like a sexual experience, and then they're all dead. And I just, you know, is this something that you were kind of exploring here? I know you mentioned earlier about, you know, touching on the final girls being kids as being just girls.
Well, you know, I mean, a lot of the slashers that came out like 78 to 84 and that sort of golden age were really, the main characters were teenagers. And so they were aimed at a teen audience, you know, and then they progressively sort of like kids like to watch up, like younger kids want to see what older kids are watching. So you wind up in the late 80s, early 90s, where you had a line of YA kind of middle grade books with Jason and Michael Myers in them, like killing kids, and they're aimed at like young readers. It's really weird. But you know, this kind of linking of like the sex and the violence, and it goes back so far. It's funny when you look at Jack the Ripper. advertisers would pay extra to have their advertisements put on the same page of penny newspapers that had illustrations of the Ripper's victims on it, because they were all women. And the illustrations, they were shown their nude bodies, for journalistic integrity. And you look at them and they all have really perky, unblemished, untouched breasts. And so it's like, it's right there in 1888. But the real place you see it linked a lot is ground zero for almost all slashers. I mean, really all of them is as a couple, it's like three urban legends in particular, but the big one is the one, The Hook. And it's two teenagers go out to Lover's Lane, they're necking, their news report on the radio, there's a maniac escaped from the local mental hospital or the prison or whatever, and he's got a hook for a hand, and they're like, this is pretty scary. And they like peel out of there, they get home, the guy goes to open the door for the girl, because it's like 1960, and there's a hook hanging from the door because like the guy was about to open it and they ripped his arm off. And it's like, it's all right there. Isolated location, kids about to have sex, someone's escaped from a mental hospital or a prison. He has an unusual weapon, no name, no face, and they barely escape with their lives and are like, we're never going to make out again. It's like, but that goes back to 1947 is around the time people first tracked those stories. Ann Landers had a column about it as a real incident in 1960. I mean, it's been hugely informative to this genre, and it's all right there in the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, you are so knowledgeable about this. It's really fun to talk about. And it's this, your research and your knowledge about these things you're kind of well known for it with, all the paperbacks from hell, reading all of those horror paperbacks. And then I read that for the Southern Book Club's guide, you like read all of the big 1990s book club books and all the vampire books.
Well, I wouldn't say all the vampire books. I think that's actually, I would probably be dead right now. No, but I did read as many of those big book club books as I could, just because it was such a weird, different world. Do you know what I mean? Like The Beans of Egypt, Maine. Like there's a book title I haven't heard in years since I saw my mom's book club reading it. And like, early Barbara Kingsolver stuff. And it was just wild to sort of see how different the literary landscape was. But yeah, I mean, I try to as much as possible. Just, I like to know where I am before I begin, And I also, and there's also, I really believe everything comes from somewhere. Like things don't just arise out of the ether. You can always find somewhere they started.
Yeah, and I'm really interested, particularly in your research of these slasher films, because you've written a novel that is in response to them, that is, I wouldn't say correcting things, but is just in conversation with them, and maybe taking a different bent with them. But much like when you're a novelist writing about a difficult character, maybe an unlikable character, it's really apparent if a novelist doesn't find something redemptive or doesn't love those characters, even when they're a problem, or even if they're if they're bad people. You can tell when there's judgment coming from the novelist. So how do you walk that line with something like commenting on the slasher movie industry? You must in some part of yourself love them. What do you love about them? And does that make it easier to dismember them?
Well, I mean, listen, I love these movies. I really do. For better or for worse, richer and poorer, they exist, and I have a relationship with them. And that's sort of where this book came from, is me sort of being like, I've been watching horror movies, and not just slasher movies, but horror movies for like 40 years of my life. And it's like, that means I've watched people get murdered for like my entertainment for a very long time. And like, what does that mean for me? And but often when I'm writing the book, a lot of it comes from the characters, and it usually takes me a while to get there. But like, I love these women. I mean, they're my imaginary playmates. They've lived in my head for years. Like, I have so much genuine affection and gratitude towards them. I mean, a lot of times this was my safe place. There was something I always knew what the last like couple of paragraphs were of this book, but like I I hadn't really stuck the ending. Even after I sold it to Berkeley, I was like, man, this is like a B minus ending. This is, I don't know, but I'm tired. And it was, I went down to South Carolina in August of last year, during the pandemic, which was weird to travel during the pandemic. And my mom had gotten really sick, and I needed to go down there and sort of live with her for a little bit. And I realized sort of like what I needed to do with the ending. And so being able to write Lynette from being a shut-in agoraphobe who can't leave her house because everything outdoors is going to kill her, and even going to the supermarket requires like an enormous like game plan for her, like living that like that was my life, and being able to write her to a better place where she can sort of move on past that was like, dude, that was uh, my imaginary friend did me an enormous solid for my own mental health. Like that was enormously big for me. Um, so I don't just like these women, I like owe them a lot.
Mhm.
So but then to sort of know about the genre and where the pitfalls are and where the bodies are buried and what thing I might repeat without actually knowing I'm perpetrating, perpetuating some kind of like rancid stereotype, that's my job. Like,
Mhm.
I don't want to write a book that does harm. Like, I want to write a book that leaves things better than it found them. And so these franchises exist. I love them, warts and all, and there are a lot of warts. Some of them are more wart than kissable skin, but uh, I needed to know all the pitfalls before I write the book. You know what I mean, or as I write the book, to make sure I
Mhm.
don't fall into one of them.
Lynette does have a support group, so the titular support group, um, and the book kind of opens, so you kind of get to see the nature of one of these meetings. And I mean, a group like this is a sacred thing, but it's also tremendously fragile because it's maintained by the people within it, and they are fragile people. And it got me thinking a little bit. It's delicate in the way that a book club is sometimes delicate, but
Mhm.
also really special when it's right. And I just wanted to know, what do you love about groups like these? What is drawing you to them, and what keeps a group like this together in your mind?
Shared experience, honestly. I mean, I've done some group therapy before, and I've been in groups like this where there's something about that when you start out with that commonality of experience and people are honest about it, it's enormously, you suddenly see yourself reflected in someone else and you're like, oh, that's me. And then you start treating them the way you want to be treated. And it's like the stuff like being, keeping everyone's, confidence, that comes as second nature in a group that's working. And a lot of that to me was my mom's book club that, I sort of, and thinking about that got me writing Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. But I just saw it from the outside when I was growing up, because they've been around for like 48 years or something ridiculous. Um, so I saw them from the outside and thought they were a bunch of annoying middle-aged women. And as I got to know them as individuals, as adults, and realized how many horrible, not horrible, but like, life crises they'd gone through together that I never knew about, that they sort of kept it to themselves and dealt with these things, I was like, oh, got it. That's how adults make friends. Like, it's not as flashy as teenage friendship, it's not as passionate, but it's a lot more stable, and it's a lot more, when you're a teenager, someone's going to do things for you, and that's great. When you're an adult, someone's going to save your kid's life. Someone's going to be there for you when you get divorced. Someone's going to be there for you when your kid goes into the hospital. Like, adult friendships are just quieter, and when they were quieter and more stable, and ultimately really go the distance.
Mhm. Now, the last thing I want to ask you about is Lynette also has another special relationship, and it's with a plant named Final Plant. And actually, I brought my plant
Oh,
today to join us.
yeah.
And actually, you mentioned the pandemic, and we saw throughout the pandemic a lot of discussion about people's plant buying activities. And
Mhm.
I just wanted, is this a nod to that? Are you a plant person? Tell me about the plant.
I am a I am the Jason of the plant world. Like, a plant enters my house and it is dead soon. It's terrible. And I'm less like Jason. I'm more like the killer in Funhouse, who's just like a deformed monster son who kills because he doesn't know any better. Like I'm like, I want the plant to live. I'm like, what's his name in Mice and Men? Like my hands are too big.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. But but I do have, and I think everyone does, we all have weird relationships. And I don't want to say inanimate because plants are, living things, but we all have deep relationships with inanimate objects, or you know what I mean? Like it
Mhm.
could be a plant, it could be a stuffed animal from when we were a kid. It could be, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times, and I'm really conscious of it. I've been around someone who's like, bumped into something in their apartment, a table, and they say, "Oh, excuse me," or "Sorry," and I'm like, "You're apologizing to furniture, dude." But like, we project a lot onto the stuff in our lives, and and listen, I mean, I'm not saying pets aren't sentient, but I guarantee you that probably everyone listening to this who has a pet has had a long, deep conversation with that pet about their feelings. And the pet probably doesn't follow that, but it doesn't matter. Like, and so I just think like Fine was my attempt to put that into a book. Like, because I feel like I see those relationships in real life and I don't see them so much in books.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today,
Oh,
Grady. And to those who've tuned in, thank you. And be sure to check out our Private Eye July issue, including our starred review of the Final Girl Support Group. It's out now, published by Berkeley, and be sure to check it out. Thank you so much.
oh, dude, thanks for having me.